What happens when your life is totally turned upside down by political forces in your home country of China? What do you do? Find out as I interview Bright Sheng.
Uncommon Sense with Junia, sharing the wisdom and insight of those who have been there and done that.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Uncommon Sense. A special warm welcome to those of you who are tuning in for the first time. We hope you will continue to do so and become part of our Uncommon Sense family. This is a show about real people and real life as it's lived in the beginning of the 21st century. My guests share what they've learned in life with us, their wisdom and their experience. With me today is Bright Sheng, a composer, a conductor, and the Leonard Bernstein Distinguished Professor of Music. Distinguished University Professor of Music at the University of Michigan. So welcome, Bright. You know, you've had a very unusual life, perhaps more than any guest I've ever interviewed. What was it like in the times you were born and raised in China?
When I was born, and actually at the time was quite normal childhood. You know, my family was a middle-class family. We had a piano at home, and my parents were intellectuals, and so were my grandparents. But a lot of history I didn't know until later, that how my grandfather was actually a big landlord in the suburb of Shanghai, and he was educated here in the United States. He got his master's degree of electrical engineering from University of Wisconsin in Madison, and went back and worked as an engineer, but he also did investment and opened shops and so forth. So after 1949, when the communists took over China, what they at the beginning they were allowed, my grandparents were allowed to take some profits from the old shops that was taken away by the government, but gradually that was stopped. But the worst time came during the Cultural Revolution. That's when I started to realize my family was actually the enemy of the state.
What was the beginning of the Cultural Revolution? How did your family experience that personally?
Well, the Cultural Revolution was actually, now I learned, was a political rivalry between, at the highest level of the Communist Party, between Mao and one of his rivalries. But in order to regain power, Mao had to start completely destroy the whole government system. So everything before that worked was supposed to be bad. And he started by going to sending the Red Guards to people's house. And our house was lived with Red Guards for 2 weeks. So everything was turned upside down.
The Red Guards lived with you?
Well, they lived in the house, yeah, search for, you know, supposed to be bad things, but there's nothing, you know, they took away everything, you know, including the piano and everything. So, you know, and were beaten. My parents, my grandparents were beaten. I was beat up by kids because I was a little enemy anybody can beat. So it was difficult. But later I learned my situation wasn't unique. It was one of the thousands of people and millions of people who suffered during the Cultural Revolution. Ultimately, I think the Cultural Revolution was a bad experience even for those people who were successful during the time. I think ultimately they were the victim, like the Red Guards. At the beginning, Mao used them to gain power. And once he achieved that, and these young high school and college students were sent to countryside to be farmers. So they were used, but that generation actually was the lost generation, so to speak, because they never had a proper education. And by the time China went through political reform after Mao, after the Cultural Revolution, these were the people that didn't have any skills.
The Cultural Revolution started in what year?
1966.
And so you were already a youngster at school.
Yes.
Were you allowed to go to school during these 2 weeks in the early part of the Cultural Revolution?
Yes, the school were opened, but they were not in normal sessions. It was all kind of revolutions, and one of the missions of Mao's Cultural Revolution was to dramatically reduce the education level, because he himself was some kind of intellectual, but he was very afraid of intellectuals, because he knew that these sort of people would ask questions and question his policy, question his behavior. But the people he trusted most were these peasants that fought for him, and the illiterate poor, and he gave them power, gave them money, and so these were people who were very loyal to him, and those were the army generals at the time.
I once talked to a Chinese person who was sent to the farms, supposedly to learn the wisdom
Right.
of the farmers, and he said to me something I'll always remember. He said, "I learned it in 8 minutes, but I was there for years." What happened to your family as the Cultural Revolution progressed?
Well, my grandparents were driven to suicide shortly, within the first year or so. And it was very difficult, because I was brought up by my grandmother. I was very close to my grandmother, so it was difficult when they actually, later I found they were actually, they killed themselves, because they couldn't sustain the physical humiliation and, and the whole thing. They were sent back to the county where they used to be the landowners, and now they was subject to humiliation, to hard labor, manual labor. And they were old. They were in their 70s. They didn't want to live through that. So, but for me, I didn't understand all that. And so as any young kid, you have survival instinct.
Right.
You try to survive. You try to do whatever you're supposed to do. And then after my junior high school, at the time there was no high school, there was no college. So the junior high school was the highest education level one could learn at the time. So you're graduating from junior high and you're 15 years old, and you're supposed to work. And you had no skill, you had no choice. So Mao realized that's going to be a social problem, because if it's a huge population and out of work, out of education, and they had nothing to do, so he invented something called re-education by the peasants. So everybody was sent to farms to be re-educated by the farmers, although these farmers were actually illiterate.
Right.
At the time, that was the only job every youngster faced, and there's no career choice. You can't you can't say I want to be this and want to do that. And the only choice was music or entertainment. If you had any talent in singing, dance, or performance, or playing an instrument, you might be admitted by a performance group like symphony orchestra or ballet schools, to take you as a young student. This was a sort of a twisted situation, because Madame Mao, Mao's wife, who was running, who was number 2 literally at the time, and because of her own background was in performing arts, so she sort of controlled so-called the propaganda sector, and she gave more funding for youngsters to for groups to take young people to educate them, to train them. So at the time, everybody tried to play the violin, because if you don't want to be farmer, you better be in the so-called showbiz.
Right.
So fortunately, I had some piano lessons when I was a kid, and my parents' intention was never for me to become a musician professional. It was just part of the education. I had a tutor came to the house, took piano lessons, which was unusual in Shanghai, right. Even at the time. But for mid-class intellectuals, if you have a piano at home, and you would have that, it's quite popular now.
Were you learning Western music?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I started with the little Thompson books, it was. Yeah, studied, played Tchaikovsky and Chopin, things like that. But until the Cultural Revolution started, when the Red Guard came and took away the piano.
Did you stay in China?
I stayed until in Shanghai, I stayed until after graduating from junior high. And then I auditioned for various performing arts groups, because I didn't want to be a farmer. But because of my so-called political background, right. Because my grandfather was an enemy of the state, they looked right. down for 3 generations. So I was the little enemy. So I couldn't get into major cities until this group from Qinghai, which is on the border of Tibet and China, came to Shanghai to take young people. And so they were a little bit loose because they couldn't get other people to go. Yeah. So they took me, and I ended up living there for 7 years.
Without your parents or with your parents?
Just by myself, no. My parents stayed 14, in Shanghai.
15? How old
I was 15. And Qinghai was part of Tibet, goes back, hundreds of years. The part that we know as Tibet in Chinese called Xizang, and its translation is Western Tibet. So Qinghai, it was the Eastern Tibet. Mm-hmm. But in the last few hundred years, the Chinese had occupied that part. So it was considered a Chinese province, but the majority of the population there, at least at the time I was there, was still Tibetan.
So you actually had food and a place to live and studies to do.
Well, it wasn't, food, yes, in the larger sense, I was starving, but wasn't fed well, but I wasn't dying of, starvation. And I worked as a so-called professional musician. I was part of the member of the provincial folk music dance group. And we performed in the city, in the capital, city of Qinghai, which is called Xining. And then we also, every year, we went down to the grassland and to perform for the Tibetans and different people. As far as studying goes, I didn't have a teacher, because I was there, 15 years old. I was supposed to have a teacher who trained me, and they supposed to train me, and they didn't really have any teacher. And I soon found out I was actually the best pianist in the whole
Were you
province.
then continuing your studies by yourself?
Well, first they sent me to Xi'an, which is also on the northwestern part of China. It was a little bit bigger, and I had studied there for almost 2 years. And then I went back, and I really became the best over there. And it wasn't because I was terribly good, because everyone else was even lack of these opportunities of being taught. So I was essentially self-taught. And during those 7 years, I found what kind of interesting experience. There are 2 things I found quite helpful, positive, came out from these experiences. One was because I didn't have a teacher.
Right.
So I was forced into a situation to be self-taught. So I created this habit of, listening to tapes and watching other people play, or take one lesson once a year. We were allowed to go back to Shanghai, visit our family, and we were given one lesson, and then I would go back and digest for the full year, things like that. And I think that was very helpful.
What was the second thing you said you learned?
Well, the second thing was because, also related to the first thing, because I didn't have much opportunity to learn. I was studying, for example, Mozart sonatas, Chopin etudes, playing the piano on my own.
Even though they were Western music and the West was
well, we were allowed to study ourselves. I was given a piano and practice ourselves, but we were not allowed to perform in public, because everything performed in public was supposed to be censored through. So therefore, I realized there's something else. I need to learn something. So I was absorbed by the folk music there. The folk music became very close and very dear to me, and I studied those, and I spent time with the folk singers. And the folk music in Qinghai province was a phenomenon, because first of all, Qinghai was a very isolated place. There's a lot of mountains, and in history there was a place that nobody wanted to be. So if you had, it was the people for exiles in the Chinese capitals, or the people that different tribes and from different ethnic groups, and they had, if you had a fight with your king or something, and you escaped there, you fled there, and people would leave you alone. A little bit like Australia to England in the early days.
Right. What? It seems to be one of the things that one had to learn is how you handle trust of other people. Your life was so tumultuous. The times were so threatening. Was trust something you did or did not put in others? How verbal were you about?
That was very difficult, because since I was very young, there were a lot of lying going on in the politics, in the whole, the whole Cultural Revolution, and the face that Mao put it on was a whole big lie. Of course, later on when realized, I started to realize shortly after I, went to Qinghai and started to grow up. So my outlook to the world, it was based on that. And of course, I was too young to be involved with a performing group and to be part of, with adults, and there was a lot of local politics going on, and there was sectors, and there was sections of this side and the other side, and there was also fighting and all that. So I was caught up with that. I learned it in a very hard way. So
what advice would you have for people, I can't say in a similar situation, but when they are in places they did not choose to be, although this is something you elected to do because it was the best choice at the time. What advice would you have for people to try and learn adaptability, or to make a progress in really largely a foreign, I wouldn't say foreign culture, but in a different environment than the way you were raised? What did it pull out of you? What did you rely on?
Well, I think if you're eager to learn, like I was, because the Chinese tradition of intellectual knowledge is everything. So I was just trying to do something creative or educational every day. I remember we have our friends, we used to, there's not much work there. So people would get together and chat away and have small parties and all that. But every day before I went to bed, I would ask myself, what did I do something interesting in learning? Did I learn something? Did I study a little bit? So I could be very tired, but I would spend a couple of hours and reading some books and do something, practice and so forth. So that actually showed after the Cultural Revolution, when all these youngsters were sent to, far away from the major cities, either as a farmer or as, whatever they're doing, they wanted to go back to the big cities. The only way one could at the time was get into major universities, which were located in major cities. So it was difficult, but I was accepted on the first round. So
because of what you knew, but even though your family was the enemy of the state?
Well, after the Cultural Revolution, that wasn't considered, that wasn't an issue anymore.
Okay.
It wasn't as much. Gradually, and they're supposed to give you back the land, the things that they took and all that, but never happened.
Never happened. Did you find that you wanted to stay in China after you went to university?
Well, I went back to the Shanghai Conservatory after the college reopened, the first year, 1978, after the conservatory reopened, and took students by merit. You have to go through, auditions,
right,
exams, and so forth. And I was their #1 choice. By then, I wanted to be a composer, because I wasn't quite a composer there. I was mostly a performance musician. I played the percussions, I played the piano, I conducted, and so I was their #1 choice. But it was, when I went back to Shanghai, I found I was completely at home, because they created this atmosphere. You just want to learn, and the teachers were willing to teach, and the students were willing to learn. That was a great environment.
You mentioned before we started the interview that you're something of a rebel, such as you may not follow totally the rules, and you told me a little story about first day of first grade. How did that side of you live, or what did you do along that as you were growing up?
I think this part of the personality, which I got me into a lot of trouble, especially when I was a kid. Maybe still does.
Right.
But I think what's interesting was, as a creative artist or as any artist, you want to find your own way. Mm-hmm. The story I told you was the first grade, the first day of the first grade school, and we put on new clothes, new school bags. Everybody was very excited. My parents took me to the school, and actually I liked my first grade teacher very much, and she liked me. The last class of the day was a gym class, and the teacher said, well, with the small kids there, we hold each other and play a train. We walk around, and he asked us, say, where do you want to go? Everybody say, we want to go to Beijing, which is the capital, to see Chairman Mao. It was a very patriotic kind of way to look at it. I said, no, I don't want to go to Beijing. I want to go to Suzhou, the next city near Shanghai. And the teacher was very upset. So he said, you have a unicorn on your head. You are different from other people. You stay. You don't get to go home after school. So I stayed, and my father said, what happened? All these other kids came home, and you didn't come. And he came to school to find me, and the teacher gave him a lesson. So I think, in a way, it's part of your personality and helped me maybe as a creative artist.
To think differently?
To think differently. You always find your own path, so to speak. You don't, just because everybody else says so, you just follow. I always try not to do that. I mean, it's just part of my personality. Everybody says this way. I think about it, whether that's true or not. I think it twice before I follow it. So perhaps that's helpful as an artist, or as any profession. I think.
Right.
I think the best teacher you can ever have is yourself.
We want to thank Bright Sheng for being with us today. We learned a great deal from him. A lot of life is serendipity, of things you have no control over. His family had a wonderful life in China until the communists came into their Cultural Revolution period. His life was totally disrupted. Through, again, serendipity, he played on something that was tangential to his life, music, was able to get a spot in the provinces for future study. Always made it a point every night to learn something, to spend a couple of hours on that, to push himself to study through tapes and observation on his once-a-year return to visit his family. Trust was something he had to be careful about, When he was able to come back to the universities after that period was open, he was the #1 applicant, in part because he prepared himself. The importance of preparation in life is key, no matter whether you have teachers or not, and he did not. He found out that something that was a personality attribute, which got him in trouble in first grade, namely the ability to think for himself, is actually an asset in his life as a composer, but in his life totally, that in a sense you become your own teacher and your own guide. So thank you, Bright Sheng, for being with us today, and thank you for tuning in, and remember, kindness counts. Please do something sweet for someone today, something helpful, something that might be an errand, a smile, cutting someone some slack when they cut you off on the highway, because we want to build an America that's entrepreneurial, that's compassionate and kind. Thank you, and we'll see you next time. And thank you. So interesting, because
To share your comments and suggestions, contact Junia. The email address is juniadone@aol.com, or write to Post Office Box 169, Midland, Michigan 48640.